Welcome back to Visited by Voices Live on a Friday at 6 p.m., which is a little bit earlier than usual. I hope everyone out there is doing well. The reason we're starting a little bit earlier today is because our guest today is joining us from a long way off over in the UK. This is our friend of the show and horror writer, winner of Weakest Link, just a stunning person, Rachel Power. Hey, Rachel.
Hiya, how you doing, Lorne? Good to see you.
I'm well. I'm well. In a time when not many people can say the same, I've been doing pretty well. So I'm not going to spend my time complaining.
Yeah, for 2020. It's been one long horror film, I think.
Yeah, the irony there is that you know, they're doing a Stephen King adaptation of The Stand this year, and they skipped the thing that would be most relevant to what we're going through now.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting watching that because they're sort of showing adverts for it over here. I think it's on Stars Play, and I'll be very interested to see that because, of course, I've read the book many moons ago, and I've of course seen the miniseries, the original miniseries of it. So I'll be very interested to see similar feelings about Salem's Lot. I was really looking forward to this James Wan's version of Salem's Lot, which I think has kind of disappeared, and now there's sort of rumors on the wind of something else possibly being released around Salem's Lot. And Salem's Lot is, of course, my favorite Stephen King book.
Wow, we'll get to that for sure, because there's a recurring theme on the show about early King versus later King, but we'll get there.
Okay.
So, for those who are not familiar with you, why don't you give us a synopsis of, combined DNA till now?
Okay. Well, a bit about me in terms of who I am. I've had a very varied, interesting life. I was an actress for a while. You know, just without the horror, I went to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, trained as an actor, and I did a lot of television and theatre for. Unfortunately, no horror, which is my true love. I then did an English language and English literature degree, and I wrote a paper on Dracula and studied 19th century novels, including Frankenstein and Dracula. And I've recently been teaching Gothic horror as a module in A-level to 18-year-olds. I'm a fledgling horror writer, so I've written, self-published a book called The Park Gates Will Shut at Dusk, which I intend to turn into a large anthology of short stories, because I'm a bit of an M.R. James fan as well. And horror, I've been a horror fan since about the age of 7 years old. So I have what I'd like to think of quite an extensive knowledge of horror films, books, writers, and I'm 52 now. So as you can imagine, I've got like quite a large general knowledge of horror, going way back to Count Yorga, beginnings of Hammer and Amicus, right up to I regularly watch Netflix and the latest horrors coming up. And I watch my favorite last horror series, I think, was The Strain. And I'm a big vampire fan, but it depends. I don't like romantic vampires. I'm not into Twilight whatsoever. I like them really terrifying, like Salem's Lot, and 30 Days of Night. Those are my kind of vampires. So that's a bit about me.
Have you checked out the film Blood Vessels?
No.
Oh, so it's I think the course correction that the vampire subgenre has needed for the last 25 years. It brings the vampire back into the class of true monster. Not just humans, humans afflicted, true monsters.
I've got to see that.
I'm pretty sure that you can it's either going to be on Netflix or Hulu, but you can buy it you can rent it on Amazon for like $3. It'll be completely worth it.
I'm definitely going to look at it. I recently joined Arrow and Shudder. I joined them about a year ago on Amazon for channels, so I'm constantly combing through them for like, you know, I'm a bit of a classicist. I think we're having a conversation before, like yourself, but I'm always looking for really impressive new horror films. I watched I rewatched Grave Encounters again recently because I absolutely adore that film, and then I watched the sequel. So I'm doing a bit of a kind of trawling back through stuff I've seen. I normally watch horror. If I really like a horror film, I see it up to about 5 times. So I'm one of those people that revisits it. Or if I didn't initially like it, I'll give it another chance. And sometimes something I didn't initially like, I end up watching a lot afterwards.
Our good friend Zombie 7979 is saying that Blood Vessel is on Shudder.
Right. That's on my list to watch. I shall watch that this weekend.
Oh, and then you're gonna have to get back with me and let me know, because I think you're gonna love it.
I'll Twitter you. I'll tweet you what I think of it.
That would be awesome. Let the community see it as well. He also has a question for you already, which was, did you see Castle Rock on Hulu?
No, I haven't seen Castle Rock. I've just finished. Funny enough, I'm one of the few people, and this is very controversial now, I'm probably going to get screamed at by Walking Dead fans. I'm one of the few people that preferred Fear the Walking Dead. And I just finished season 5 because it was free, of course. So I do like the word free. I think we all do. I've just finished season 5 on Prime, and I'm just hoping to watch season 6 of it. So I'm going back. But Castle Rock, I don't know anything about. I've heard mention. What is Castle Rock about?
Castle Rock takes the world of Stephen King and all the characters and removes the actual stories they're from, and just tells like new season-long story arcs using those characters. That doesn't mean they're saying those stories didn't happen, but it's using those characters inside just a combined Stephen King world. I've not seen any of it.
Is Barlow and Straker in it?
Again, I haven't seen any of it. So if Zombie 7979 knows, Charlie, let us know. But I wanted to back up a second here, because we talked about, you mentioned Count Yorga being the inciting incident.
Whole thing, yeah.
So tell me that story.
Count York Vampire's guilty for my horror addiction. For any of you old enough like me, or young enough and you just like going back in time, Count York Vampire. I was 7 years old, and my dad was a huge horror fanatic, and he used to watch all the Hammer and stuff. And so one night he agreed to let me stay up late. And what he used to do was he used to say, "I'll get you to put your hands over your eyes when the frightening bits are on." And of course, what he did was the opposite, because he had quite a sick sense of humour. So of course, when something really frightening was about to happen, he said, "It's all right, you can open your eyes now," at the very moment where something terrifying is on the screen. And so we were watching Count York Vampire, and the reason it sticks in my memory is I find it really, I watched it again 10 years ago, and there's a scene where I think it's by the dock or by the boats, and it's like, it's all really quiet and nothing happens, and suddenly out of nowhere, Count York sort of runs like towards the camera down the dock, bangs bared, the cloak flying out behind him. And of course, I absolutely can't swear on here, but whatever. I shat myself virtually, watching that. And that was it. That was it. I was at my dad's ankles to watch horror all the time, and so that then sparked. Of course, Hammer was on, and I just want to give a special shout out to the great Barbara Shelley, who died a couple of days ago, and she lived down the road from me, and I never got the opportunity to meet her, but my mum knew her, and they used to have a chat in the local supermarket. And Barbara was 88 when she died, and of course she was a great Hammer. So yeah, it led me on to Hammer. I'm a particular Dracula fan, of course. So Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, absolute classic. Amicus, then I love The Beast Must Die and stuff like that. So I was just literally, and I loved the horror anthologies, so like Tales from the Crypt, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, all these absolute classics. So of course I was just, and then my reading kind of started. So around 12, I had a special treat where we used to go to a shop called Debenhams on Saturdays. And my mum would go off and buy clothes, and I would go straight to the book section. And I think, if I'm right, this is the early 80s now, and Stephen King was under Richard Bachman. And of course, I started to buy Stephen King books. So I read Night Shift, started off with the short stories. I think I can't remember if he wrote The Mist. But then I was also starting to read other really interesting. I loved short stories. That was what I started off with as a kid. So I had 65 Great Tales of Horror. And there's a lot of authors I can't actually remember. But were really exciting horror stories, like the guy that's writing a diary, and if you no idea, and he turns out that he's starting to get more and more sick as he writes the diary, and it turns out that he's turning into a werewolf and stuff like that was happening. Then there was the Slime, the Raft, I think it was, which is based on the other, the kids stuck in the middle of the lake, and so I was starting to kind of start really devouring short stories, and of course then that leads me on to Salem's Lot, and I was away on holiday in Brighton with my family, and they were downstairs. I was about 14 years of age, and I was upstairs in the hotel room reading Salem's Lot, and of course I'm reading at exactly the moment where the Glick boy is scratching away at the window to get Danny to open let me in. And of course I start hearing scratching on the window, so I'm freaking out as a pigeon or something, because I have a very overactive imagination. So of course I'm then reading horror and watching, and of course you had the video nasty. So my friend had a Betamax. So in the 80s, she bought a Betamax, and of course she became my best friend then, because I wasn't allowed one, because my dad had a sort of strange idea that, we shouldn't have them in the house. And then, of course, we started to go down to the local video store, buying, videos like this size, taken the bat. And that was my first introduction to The Exorcist, which became one of my favorite horror films of all time. I read the book as well. And there's not many situations where the book, for me, matches the film. Because The Exorcist is also a brilliant book. But that's one of the few, and of course that then, it was so shocking, because you think 1972, The Exorcist is made, and only about 4 years before that is Hammer Horror. So the jump is just wild. You can't even begin
Well, yeah.
So
Well, I always remind people that, Night of the Living Dead comes out in '69, and by '73 we have the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So you're talking about in the course
absolutely,
of less than 5 years,
yeah,
the genre basically the doors got kicked in and the chickens all got eaten in that 5 year period. And there was no shutting that Pandora's box after
yeah,
that. And as
absolutely,
much as I love classic horror, my heart is always going to be in the '30s. There's no question about that.
yeah.
You need progress. You need to move past. And it's just interesting that you have this moment where a spike happens. And I do think,
It was a real spike as well. I mean, if you read the newspaper, the at the time The Exorcist is released, it caused. I mean, there were people fainting. I mean, this is actually documented. You know,
mhm,
they were fainting, they were screaming because it's fantastic documentaries on The Exorcist. You know, churches were banning it, saying it was evil. I mean, I actually about 20 years ago, I bought The Exorcist. I wanted my mum to watch it. Now, being rather sick of me, but I wanted to see what she thought, and she was so frightened of it. She wanted me to take it back to the video shop. She didn't even want the video in the house. So what's amazing, what is extraordinary about that one is it still has the same power, I think, today as it did back in the 70s. Um, but yeah, you mentioned Texas Chainsaw Massacre comes out, Driller Killer. You know, there's all these like. I'm not an intensely slasher type person, but I love the Texas Chainsaw Massacre because it was just this for me. There's a slasher sometimes which engages me so much. For me, I don't even see it as a. I mean, I thought it was an extraordinary. It was Tobe Hooper, I think, who did that, and of course
mhm.
Salem's Lot as well. So my journey through horror is like 14. We start watching all these Betamax videos and watching Steam. Then James Herbert, of course, turns up on the screen on the scene with books, and we've got The Fog. And we were
Rats.
actually doing that around class. I mean, everybody wanted to read the gym scene. So of course, you know, it was like the book was open, being passed around all the class to sort of read the most horrific. And then after that, I think my friend said to me, "You're reading too much horror." And what? Yeah. Oh my god. Wow.
Yeah,
Funny enough, I
that
still
came
read.
off my shelf of my favorite novels, by the way.
Wow. It's a beautiful copy as well. Interestingly enough, I started reading the Haunting of Cratchley Hall. I can't remember exactly what it was with James Herbert recently. I wasn't too. It was okay. I actually preferred an early James Herbert, like Fluke. I'm not later on, not, but I haven't read much late James Herbert. What then happened about the age of 18? One of my friends said to me they thought I was taking a really unhealthy interest in horror and wanted me to start reading other stuff. So I made a real big attempt because she was at university. So she started passing me all her university books like Ragtime and by E.L. Doctorow, and I started to try and broaden it. But I think once a horror fan, always a horror fan, and it's just I just found out I much preferred horror, so I went back into that. So over the years, I've always wanted to be a horror writer. It's been virtually impossible with all the responsibilities I've had. Um, but I've followed it forensically, and I mean, one of the most exciting times when I've discovered Fright Fest. So every year, I mean, I've got a friend of mine, Paul Ewan, and he dresses up regularly as a zombie. It's just his thing, and he's very good at it. And he told me about Fright Fest. I got a pass. I went along, and it was fantastic. Like I'd come home. You know, and what's exciting is you always get a chance to meet somebody who, in the horror community, you don't appreciate who they are unless you're fully in the horror community. So when they had Karen Black, like I said to you before, Karen Black turning up, Twins of Evil, you know, for the festival, really exciting. Vampires have been my particular thing. So of course I followed Dracula relentlessly. I think I've got virtually every series made by them. One of my favorite Draculas was Louis Jourdan. Of course, in about 1977, the BBC made an adaptation of Dracula, which I thought was very successful because I have seen others which I thought, you know, not so great. And then, of course, I then did a degree, and I was lucky enough to be able to study Victorian Gothic. So I then had a chance to look at the 19th century, and I studied The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dracula, Frankenstein, and I had an opportunity to expand my knowledge of horror, and also to find out a lot more of the context behind why they were written, and references in the books that I now sort of came to understand. Next thing I'm thinking about doing after the degree is an MA in Gothic horror. I'd like, I'm sort of looking around to when I'm going to do that. So I was about 50, I'm 52 now, so about 50 I decided to write. And one of the things about writing is I'm not remotely interested in fame or money, not remotely. The reason I wanted to write was I just think everybody's got a book in them somewhere, but my particular field is horror. So I was just dying to sort of have the time to actually sit down and write a book. I wanted to have a go at it and kind of like see how difficult what it was like. So I kind of thought, well, how do you write? I mean, some of the ideas I was getting were so enormous, they just turned into an MGM film, and they were just ridiculous to write. So the problem with writing is you have to edit out so many of your thoughts, because otherwise it's just crazy. There's too much. It's too big, and the book would be too enormous. So I looked at what other writers had kind of said about the art of writing, and I just kind of thought, well, my original love was short stories, and I'm sort of I like horror books, but I'm also a big short story fan. So I decided to sort of like start working on a number of short stories. I haven't been able to write as much as I'd like, but the one of the stories is kind of like, it's very difficult to write because if you've read a lot of horror and you've watched a lot of horror films, you are always veering into territory where someone goes, oh, that's just like it, or oh, that's very similar to this, and you're kind of like, it's very hard to escape, because I think the horror genre is so enormous, and when something is a hit in it, like Stephen King at the moment is just, he's omniscient, isn't he? It's like he's making like book after film after film after film. And if you're heavily influenced by a particular person in terms of horror, it's really hard to escape them. And that's the main difficulty I found in writing, is to find your own voice within the genre without falling into the trap of sounding like, but if they've been really big influences, it's really hard not to kind of go there. So I suppose, to take you up to modern, what I've been doing horror modern wise, of course, to discover Twitter, and that's where I met the brilliant Lorne on, and that was just a godsend, because I had the opportunity to link up with the horror community big time, and it was fun. It was quick and short, bite size. It was fun, but it's also linking up to people that have similar interests to yourself in a much larger scale, And it's also been a lifesaver during the virus as well, may I say, because you have an opportunity to, have a quick chat with somebody without feeling, isolated from all this horror that's been going on. So what I generally do at the moment is I'm still teaching. I sort of do English intervention teaching, so that takes up a lot of time. But, the intention is still to write the book. The other book I was going to write was so enormous. It's based on a teacher, Richard. Remember his surname in a minute. Sorry, Richard. I got talking to a guy. I was a librarian at one job before I left, and we're talking about vampires. Because one of the books I wanted to write about was a vampire, and everything I kind of like plot-wise was coming up with sounded silly. And he found a thing called a draug. I think they're sort of like Norse or Viking, and they were fascinating creatures. I started reading up on them, and they're not exactly revenants. They've got all these extraordinary skills, like they can swim through concrete walls, and they can. They're very interesting because they die. They are brought back by resentment. So they're kind of spirits that have died really angry about something, and which is what brings them back. And they've got all these extraordinary powers, but they're kind of like the powers just get like ridiculously large. And they're a bit like, they're very materialistic always got that where their burrows where they sort of hide are normally surrounded by gold and silver and things they've collected. But they're vampires. They're kind of like they're originally thought of as vampires. And I think there's actually gravestones that still exist where the Norsemen put spells on the graves to keep them in the ground.
Yeah, they would put iron nails into gravestones from churches. They'd actually pull nails from churches and put them in gravestones, because then the vampires wouldn't be able to rise out. It's funny because you talk about the differences in different locations on the vampire myths. So in what we would today call Russia, there was a completely different set of rules entirely than what we recognize from the Bram Stoker tradition, which was not really based on the Romanian accounts either. It was more of a composite account of a lot of things, as well as earlier versions of fiction, because it's not like Bram Stoker invented the vampire.
Right.
I do think you can
hardly vampire, but they were way back, weren't they? Way back.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can look and see the Mediterranean versions of what we would call vampires as a broad title. Is mostly a thing about lineage. It's mostly about dead ancestors returning to steal children.
That's right.
And it seems to be wherever the culture was at a moment, that's what the myths was built around. That's what the fear. And that's not saying that there wasn't times when people truly believed some of this stuff, but it was always built in a metaphor for the failings of the society at that time.
Yes. And that's absolutely it. It's almost like the Draug. The fact is that a spirit that is coming back because it is resentful is a warning about, sort of dying angry, essentially. I mean, the difficult thing was I was trying to sort of match up. The problem with writing sometimes is you try and match up too many ideas. So another, it was about how the Draug arrived, and I started looking at prehistoric times. It was going right back and studying a tidal wave called I think it's Stereoslide it's called, and one of the brilliant geography teacher Becky Cleary helped me with some of that, and it was the idea that of how the Draug arrives in Britain, and of course I think it was the idea that the Stereoslide cut off. What happened was there's a large chunk of rock that fell into the sea back in 6,500 BC. I might be completely wrong there I might have checked my dates. Prehistoric times, and it comes across what is a huge tidal wave. They have evidence of it, and it's possibly it cuts off. That is the bit that cuts off mainland Britain from the rest of Europe, because of course then it's one big landmass. So I was trying to work with this idea that the Draug is brought over, but I was kind of playing with history in terms of the Draug is a Norse. I believe it's a Norse mythology. So I was going right back to prehistoric times with it, and that was a way that was brought over to Britain much earlier from the Middle East as a way of clearing land, because what happened by that time, the hunter-gatherers couldn't operate properly because, of course, all the trees had grown enormously high, and, there was no way to hunt animals properly. So, and then the Middle East, I believe it was the Middle East that brought over the farming system. Just sort of like, and that's the idea of talking about tribes and about the idea that communities, and that you didn't have to kill livestock. You could actually make dairy products from them, all those kinds of things being discovered. And so the Draug is brought over, and then it starts to, rather than clearing land, it kind of, because another thing about the Draug, because they're immortal like vampires, was this idea that it starts to discover its immortality. And then, of course, it starts to achieve this godlike status within the people. And so I was kind of playing with that, but then trying to kind of merge it into a modern day whereby something comes back and starts attacking a town where people are slowly disappearing, where what's happened is it's been disturbed. So the park gate shuts at dusk was just first of all, I thought it was a creepy title. It was like literally I was walking down the road, my son in his pram, which makes me sound like a rather unwell mother. I'm sort of thinking about horror films where I'm pushing my beautiful son, and I just saw a sign that said the park gates will shut at dusk, and for some reason that sent a shiver up me, and I started thinking about vampires and the idea that the park gates are shutting because there's something in the park. And
And
so
heaven help for you if you're on the wrong side of that gate, right?
well, that's correct. I mean, it was the idea, and it was the idea that is a Draug's Burrow. It was the idea that park is deliberately being protected because there's a vampire in it. Essentially, it's made its home there. And then it was the idea of people slowly disappearing. Now, this was the problem where your influences cross over and take over your writing. Of course, people slowly disappearing in a quiet town through vampires equals Salem's Lot. So it's a kind of way of trying to difficult to write. I'm still in research mode with that one because, of course, there's a lot to, and that's what I mean by over researching, having too many ideas and trying to simplify it down. So I've just started with short stories for now. Otherwise, it takes on a life on its own and it gets far too big and unreadable.
Listen, no one is an expert on storytelling, no matter what they tell you. But if you ever want to touch base on a one-on-one with me for some ideas about how to contain ideas, I believe in the trilogy of ideas, which means that a novel is basically 3 ideas that work together in concert. And we could have that conversation if it would be good for you. And I don't want to listen. A lot of people just want to figure it out on their own without any outside voices. And I get that. I'm not pushing myself on you. I'm just saying, if you want, reach out to me.
Thank you very much, Lorne.
We have a question.
Go ahead.
This is going to this is going to derail massively in a good way. It comes from our friend of the show, Jess Graham, who asks, what are some of Rachel's favorite acting experiences?
Oh, well, I'll tell you the frustrating ones is that I wasn't in a Hammer horror, and I will never forgive Hammer for finishing before I had the chance to maturity in one. Well, they're Women in Black, of course.
And The Lodge.
My favourite acting experience in terms of now, because I finished acting in 2006. I had my son in 1997, and I actually became much more interested in staying at home and being a mum for a while, actually, than just touring and the country. And I was kind of, by then a bit jaded with it. I sort of wanted to do something else. So of course teaching was and getting further into English was more interesting to me. I enjoy the fact that I look at films and television now, and I've worked with the people that I see. So The Woman in Black, I had the honour of working with not directly with him, I was in the same play with him, was Kieran Hines, who is in The Woman in Black, and who's became absolutely massive. I mean, he was also in Ghost Rider, the second one. Yep. A Vengeance. I can't remember what it's called. Or
as I call it, the good one.
It wasn't, the one we want to forget about. I think that was the subtitle. But it was he's remarkable. What's so exciting for me is a lot of actors I see in films and horror films are people that I've worked with. My favourite acting experience has got to be, I had the opportunity to work with one of my all-time heroes. I don't know if you guys know him so well in the States, I'm sure you do. It was Rick Mayall. And he's an absolute godlike hero of mine from The Young Ones and from Filthy Rich and Fat Flap. He's in Drop Dead Fred.
Which one? Oh, then I know exactly who he is.
Rick Mayall.
I love The Young Ones.
I toured with Rick Mayall in the play, and I'm just saying to any Rick Mayall fans out there, he was, God, when he died, it was absolutely devastating. He was so iconic. He was as funny, if not funnier, in real life. He was also incredibly intelligent. I think at the time he was really interested in Hitler, and he just had piles. Well, he was very interested. He was fascinated by that time in history, I think. But he was brilliant. He was just very down to earth, wonderful. So my favourite acting experience was without question working with Rick Mayall. And I worked with Judi Dench as well. And I've got to say about Judi Dench, I love that woman. She is one of us. She's one of the boys, Judi Dench. She rolls up her sleeves and gets on with it. There's no, primness about Judi Dench. She's an absolute star as well. So I was fortunate enough to work with some really fantastic names. My, acting experience, the thing that I'm happiest about accomplishing was I accomplished working with 2 very difficult parts, which was completely diametrically opposed to my personality and me, which would have been Mary Garth in Middlemarch, which was a difficult part, but I pulled it off. And Marsha in The Seagull, I did a lot of stage work. Unfortunately, I never got a chance to do horror. So that's what I mean. You know, if I could have been in a horror film, it would have been Night of the Living Dead by George A. Romero. I would have been, or actually Dawn of the Dead. I recently released a poll. I do a lot of polls on Twitter. They're really fun. You know, you get a chance to just quickly bang off a poll, and sometimes it's a little bit of a test as well to see what people's horror knowledge is like. For instance, if I include the word Buffy in the poll, I know I'm going to get about 5 million people suddenly doing the poll. But if I include the words like Dario Argento, you know, it's sort of like you're going to get the more specialists kind of coming in. I did a poll, and of course the poll was about the trilogy, and it was which one of the trilogy of Night of the Living, you know, George A. Romero. And a lot of people go for Dawn of the Dead. It's a really hard choice for me because Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, it was so, I mean, it revolutionized for me the way zombies were thought of. But then, you know, if we go back with classicists, Plague of the Zombies, you know, that was pretty damn good as well if we go back. But in terms of, I mean, I think if I could have been, what about you, Lon? If I could be in a horror, I would want to be in Dawn of the Dead or Night of the Living Dead. I'd like to be in a Romero. What would you be in?
Oh, I was assuming I was going to be able to cast you in something. That seems more fun to me. You know, I don't think I really want to be on screen more than I am right now. And I don't think anyone else wants that either, to be honest. But let me reinvent your question. If I could have played a part in writing one of the great horror films of, you know, the last 50 years, let's say, you know, probably something like Carnival of Souls, which I think is a film that has, ironically enough, a lot of soul to it.
That meant big mention from Mark Commode recently. It's one of his top 10 favorite horrors. Yeah, Carnival of Souls. I don't think I've seen it.
Oh, you need to see it. No, I always say this on the show, so these guys are tired of it. But horror is basically stories about mortality and morality.
Great stuff.
You can't, and of course, it all comes back from the classic tradition. So there's comedy and there's tragedy, and horror is the most direct descendant in the tragic vein. But it's a stories about morality and mortality, and that's why. I think that Herk Henkel, when he made Carnival of Souls, tapped into the opposite side of how that's usually presented. I don't think people quite understand what a miraculous film that is. It's not just a spook show. It really is the haunting from the other side of the coin, and how morose and sad and disjointed and lonely. Because it's a lonely film. It's a film about loneliness more than anything else. And there's good reason she's lonely, and I kind of just ruined the movie for you. Not really, because it's such a great, it's a mood piece, so it doesn't really matter. But I think it was the first time when like someone peeled back and said, no, it's not just about something coming at you. Let's take a really different position on this.
Yes, those are the most interesting. When there's something a lot more than it's just a horror. It's a bit like Dawn of the Dead sort of being, for me, it was a lot about consumerism. You know, and but then George A. Romero, I think I think when he was asked about that, I think he kind of like went, you know, it's just, but I mean, it was, well, I've got to see Carnival of Souls. Mortality frightens me. So it's the idea of death. Is that what's, it's kind of?
It is, but it's kind of about living when you don't have that opportunity anymore. So it's a really dark film in a lot of ways, although it's sprightly and fast. It's also missing a reel, which is lost to time, but that's a whole different story. And you can't feel it, by the way. It's not disjointed at all, which is amazing. But I think that films like that actually do more for the horror genre because we're still talking about them, even though, you know, 50 years have passed. It's a blink of an eye for the genre. And I think that's important. I don't particularly love what I used to love, right? I used to love the idea of, hey, this is the 8th sequel of something, you know, and I used to be all down with that. And now I'm kind of impatient with it.
I'm just so much the same. I mean, it sounds controversial, but I'm just not, I not a Friday the 13th kind of girl, and I'm probably going to get attacked by lots of Friday the 13th fans. But I'm not into that production line, bang 'em out, you know. And though I must say, I thought the first Halloween was good. I mean, and saying that, I mean, I'm a huge John Carpenter fan because I think John Carpenter has released. I mean, I'm a big fan of The Thing, real classics, The Thing, The Fog, Prince of Darkness, huge on those. But I'm a bit like, I mean, I sat with my cousin and watched the Saw series. I don't know how many, Saw 138, I don't know how many there are now. And we watched one after another. And it was really enjoyable, but in the end, you kind of, I know it sounds weird, I don't know if you have this, you start laughing because it's a kind of repetition. It's kind of how long can they keep running these without it getting really,
it has its place, right? I think it's comfort food. You know, you don't want your cornflakes to taste any different tomorrow.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you go into a fine restaurant, you don't want to order something that you make at home.
That's it. I mean, kids love that kind of thing, and that's the thing with where I feel my age, because I'm like a classicist, like, I mean, I'm 80s, and they'll go, "Have you seen Slender Man?" You know, and who else, they'll say to me, I say I love horror, and they'll say, "Oh, I love horror too," but if they watch The Exorcist, they laugh. Some of them laugh at it, whereas I find it the most terrifying film of all time. So I don't know if generationally it's changed in horror as well a lot. If you talk to the average 18-year-old on the street about what they find frightening, or say killer clowns.
So we're really close in age. So I want to put this to you. When we were growing up, so let's just pick a year, 79 or 82. Pick a year. It doesn't really matter. What you got to realize is that to us, you know, Psycho was already an old film. But when you look at it, the movies we're talking about, when you talk about The Exorcist is an older film by calendar to these kids than Psycho was to us.
Yeah.
And it really, just to get a little bit shocking, we forget Psycho was 1960. Go back just 3 years earlier, and we had giant bug movies being all the rage.
Yeah.
So how we looked at giant bug movies is how they're looking at The Exorcist in general.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't think I know it's hard for us to have any perspective on it, and it is. But I do think that they need to create their own thing. That's not saying that we don't get our thing too.
I think it's the performances. I think, like, you know, when you take Sissy Spacek and Carrie, you know, I mean, maybe this is my horror snobbery coming out. Maybe I'm completely wrong. But when you see Ellen Burstyn, you know, when you see, I mean, like, real acting greats, kind of in a horror film, they just seem to elevate it for me. Whereas if I see a group of teenagers, I've never seen them, you know, my life just screaming their way through the film, worrying about their nails, I just can't empathize. I think for me, a great horror film as well is I have to have a hook somewhere within that film where I can connect with it, where I can empathize, where you know, that's why I thought the remake of Dawn of the Dead was enormously successful. Mm-hmm. You know, because of course, you know, people will be shuddering with horror at the idea of remaking a Romero. You know, but then I'll see a film like Mercy Black, and I'll think, oh, they're all starting, you know, Ouija, and you're kind of like, well, but saying that, I'll see some modern films you think are terrific. I mean, I thought The Paranormal Activity was tremendous. I mean, I think this kind of this sort of like, you know, the documentary style horror, which I thought was very successful with Blair Witch. You know, I suppose every movie, it would have been the same when we were watching Hammer or whatever, is you'll get a lot of kind of duds because they're all trying to emulate the same style, you know, and I suppose that kind of happens now. So they took the documentary style horror suddenly went berserk, and I was watching a hell of a lot of documentary style films. But then I say that, and I saw Grave Encounters, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. But for me, it also hinges on the performances. And if there are a bunch of people that I think are just overprivileged, spoiled kids that I can't connect to, it's got to have some depth to it at some point. I thought Scream was quite successful like that. You know, there's a couple of outstanding performances. I think for me, it's not just a horror film for me. It hinges on the writing, but also the performances. And I think this is why films like The Exorcist particularly stand out and will over time, because I think performances of people like Jason Miller and Max von Sydow and Ellen Burstyn. You know, I watched Misery the other night with James Caan and Kathy Bates, which, I mean, like, performances in it. Not only do you have a brilliant, and I want to Cell, I thought was fantastic, but a lot of people hated it. John Cusack's performance, and I thought was one of the best performances I've ever seen by Samuel L. Jackson. And I loved the film, and it was really, but the response to it was really Rotten Tomatoes, kind of like we're being, you know, and yeah, I thought it was absolutely outstanding. So I don't always have a populist view of what I think, but I do notice the generational gap sometimes, where I suddenly think, wow, I am getting old, because this teenager I'm talking to here really identifies with these kids, and I just think they're a pain in the arse, and they ought to get killed off as quickly as possible. But then, you know, I could say about The Evil Dead, you know, sort of like, you know, you sort of like look at a group of teenagers, and yet it's one of my favorite films as well. So I suppose I don't know, it's a tricky one.
So I want to, you kind of talk about the found footage thing as being something that worked for you, but whether you're talking about, you know, Paranormal Activity or whatever. But there's a title in British history that I think really informed that subgenre huge, and that's Ghostwatch.
Oh, with the Parkinson thing.
Did you have a personal experience with that?
I thought, you see, I thought it was a total fake. There's a lot of people that were like, wow, did you see the Parkinson thing? You know, I kind of watched it and I thought, well, Sophie, I mean, like, you know, because I suppose even though I watch a lot of horror, I'm a big cynic when it comes to there'll be a lot of a poltergeist activity in the BBC studios. You know, I'd have thought the ghost would have chosen a much better location to start throwing things around, like Michael Parkinson, whatever. You know, so I kind of saw it, but it was a bit like Orson Welles' you know, War of the Worlds. It generated this total hysteria that it was true. I mean, did you see it, Lord? What did you think?
Oh, of course. And now, my experience with it was obviously a little bit later. It was late 90s, and a bootleg VHS tape from a guy I used to buy VHS tapes from. You know, they were dubbed. They were just black label tapes with handwriting on them. But that's how you got some of this stuff, because there was no legal releases over here of it. And it was known what it was. You know, it didn't try and, no one tried to convince me it was real. But I thought it was tremendously effective for what it was.
It was very effective. I thought they built it up. The way they did it I thought it was very, very good.
Well, I think Pipes is one of the great cinematic ghosts of all time.
Yes. I think it was. I suppose the problem with me is my expectations kind of sometimes outweigh the reality of what it's going to be like. So if somebody says to me, you've got to see this is terrifying, like the Michael Parkinson thing. I actually didn't see it at the time. I think that was part of the problem, is I might have seen it at a later date.
It probably takes some edge off of it.
It's kind of like they had this thing over here called, oh God, it's with the Vet Fielding. It's where they go and find ghosts, and they had this, it was, again, the live thing. They decided to have this huge Ouija board contact thing in the Winter Palace Gardens, I think it was, in Eastbourne somewhere. And they were going to have this, like, you know, whenever I kind of started to watch these ghost programs where they're investigating ghosts, they're trying to find something, they're kind of jumping at shadows. The problem for me is I'm also an astronomer. So I've got a very scientific mind. So even though I love horror, I'm very logical. I mean, the most frightening thing that happened to me was 20 years ago. I live in the UK. We don't get earthquakes here, right? Right. And I wake up at 1 o'clock in the morning, and my entire bed is shaking. It's coming off the ground. Now I've watched The Exorcist. I've watched a lot of possession films, you know, the Emily Rose. I watched one the other day, Mark of the Devil, I think it was. I think not the
Sure.
film, but there was a Spanish one, I think, on Netflix. I watched that, yeah. And I watched a really good comic, Cleansing Hour, which I also watched, which I think is on Amazon Prime. So I'm big on possession films, love possession. And of course, you know, the first thing my child brain thinks of is it's oh God, you know, that's it. I've got Pazuzu who's just blowing in the window and is rocking my room around. And of course, the second adult logical, like finding logic within it, is to go, there's an earthquake. Also, there must be there's an earthquake. And then it turns out there was in Lincolnshire, there was the epicenter had been in Lincoln, there had been a mini earthquake, which had actually moved, you know, my bed. And that's so the problem for me when I watch, I really enjoy horror, but I've never watched any. I mean, like it was the Exorcist documentaries talking about these people all dying off and things, you know. 7 members of the cast died, and I'm a bit like Max von Sydow. You know, he came on the documentary and was just kind of like, well, you know, it's life, really. You know, I don't think.
Get enough people in a room, someone's going to die.
Exist. I mean, I'm the Richard Ramirez. I mean, I'm also very interested in serial killers, and of course, Netflix is about to release the Richard Ramirez serial killer documentary next week, which I've just watched the Yorkshire Ripper one, and I don't know about the things being truly evil. I think we all have slightly spooky experiences, but with the Michael Parkinson thing, the problem with me is if I watch something frightening or I come across evil, my tendency is to rationalize quite quickly and go through a series of logical explanations before I would arrive at the conclusion I was actually dealing with the supernatural. Don't get me wrong, I would be very excited if something supernatural happened. I'd be probably terrified as well if I came to the end conclusion that this had to be a supernatural event. There was no other rational explanation. I do have quite a scary story to tell you. We're up for a scary story, which I couldn't rationalize. I was bet to sleep in a graveyard when I was 16, 17. And I was bet £25 to stay the night in the graveyard. So, and of course, luckily enough, near the graveyard, there was a pub, which was quite handy for getting ready for the graveyard. So I agreed to do it. And my friend Martin, my cousin, hopefully he's watching this. Hello, Dave. We were all out at the pub and, of course, got absolutely blind drunk and went to the graveyard. And it was freezing. It was a freezing winter night, absolutely freezing. Now, this graveyard is in Harrow-on-the-Hill, and Harrow-on-the-Hill has Byron. I think Byron's buried in it. It's quite near Harrow Public School, you know, and it's got these kind of really creepy steps leading down to this like sort of like abyss of darkness. So there's kind of like 2 graveyards. There's one at the top, the posh graveyard that's quite well lit, but then you descend down into these stairs, and there's this like really old crumbling, sort of like fantastic Gothic-looking place. So it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I had to have a skinful, you know, to sleep the night in this graveyard. Martin had as well. Martin gallantly agreed to stay with me. So we decided to just try and sleep on the graveyard steps. And it wasn't necessarily sleep; it was more like unconsciousness, really. So we sort of passed out on the steps. Anyway, cut to the chase. I wait. I can hear. My eyes are closed, but I can hear. It must have been 50 yards away from me, a voice going, "Rachel, Rachel," really strongly. And I sort of come to, and I am kneeling on top of a grave, and I'm digging at it, and my hands are covered in mud. And I looked up, and Martin is standing 50 yards away from me. Just completely freaked out. We ran out the graveyard, ran down. Anyway, I'm not saying I was possessed, but of course, you have to logically go through how the hell did I walk 50 yards in my sleep and sit in some of the graveyard digging at the grave. One of the only conclusion we could come to, and this is why I like what you said about horror in terms of it being a little bit deeper than just, you know, things flying about. That's why I like The Exorcist, because for The Exorcist for me is not purely about, you know, a possessed girl. If you read the book, it's about faith. You know, it goes very deeply into the question of faith, and kind of Salem's Lot does to a degree as well, about a question of faith. Faith is, I think, is a term that often comes up in horror movies. Is, you know, do you have faith? And then, of course, the interesting philosophical argument for that is, what is faith? You know, how do you have it? Is it something that you just kind of pinned on? And just to finish very quickly with this story, is Martin suggested it could have been because the temperature when we fell asleep was -3. It was freezing. And he thinks that maybe we've still got a bit of prehistoric left in our brain, the R factor, which is the fight or flight mode. Somehow the sheer cold had woken me up, and I was digging at the earth to try and find somewhere to get warm, which is one of the possible explanations. I digress, but I just liked the idea that horror is about something a little bit more than just a lot of screaming, and that there is something a bit deeper involved in it, which is what we were talking about earlier. And some of the films I've cited, I think some of the films are just brilliant horror films and just tick all the boxes, and some of them go a little bit deeper. And the reason The Exorcist is one of my favorites is I think it taps into something a lot more than the idea of just a possessed girl. I think it taps into other ideas about asking us about ourselves. I think it's quite psychoanalytical in a lot of ways. And I think, you know, if you look at the subplot about the priest questioning his faith, you know, Jason Miller, Father Karras, you know, spends a lot of time grappling with his idea of if he's good enough, or if he's, you know, that those are the kind of hooks that hook me into a horror film, where I think is a bit more than just a kind of, I'm running around with a chainsaw cutting people's heads off.
Well, the way I've always looked at it in the most base terms is that early man, I'm not going to put a time on this, I'm just saying, early man found shelter. And the reason he found shelter was because during the day he was relatively in good shape. When it got dark, his field of vision got extremely narrow. And sometimes people who were out in the dark didn't come home. Sometimes we found remains of people who were out in the dark, but we didn't have any more evidence. There was no more knowledge base. So the very first horror story was probably carved on a wall, and a very imaginative version of a saber-toothed tiger or a bear was drawn on that wall. And it was an attempt to fill in the gaps in our knowledge. But it was done from an emotional standpoint, and that was fear and distress and disgust. All those emotions that you see at the beginning of this video describe what the horror genre is. So I think we're still kind of there, even with a personal experience like yourself. Maybe it was something as simple as you were a little bit intoxicated still, and you were reaching for your blanket thinking you were still, because you lose where you are, and you were thinking you're still at home, you're reaching for your blanket, not realizing you're digging in a grave, you know. But on another level, it could have been just an accumulation of a lot of different things, including the power of suggestion that you were sleeping in a graveyard. Maybe something spooky will happen. But the thing is, we're our own worst judges of it. And that's where horror lives, because the point where you can't trust what you experience to a certain degree because we don't have enough information, that's us as primitive man looking out and seeing dusk fall, seeing the sun go down over the mountain range, knowing that now all your advantages are leaving with the sunrise until the sunrise. We do have some questions for you in the chat. I don't want to leave these guys feeling like I'm ignoring them. Darren Burrows asks, what are your favorite Argento and Fulci films?
Oh, you got me here. Fulci, you'd have to, like, Argento. Now, Argento and Fulci, I am limited on, but I think it was, right, I think it's an Argento, well, Demons, without question for me with Argento. I actually love the Demons. Now, I think Argento, correct me if I'm right, was it Zombie Flesh Eaters?
That's Fulci.
Fulci. Right,
Yep.
is that the one with the sequence of him walking underwater fighting the shark?
Yes.
That was like
bonkers.
Jeez, I mean, it was at that point. I mean, I remember the, so I think Argento. I haven't seen some of the others. I think the only main ones I saw of Argento was Demons and Demons 2. I think he was hugely influential as a producer in other films. I think he was involved with Halloween 2.
No.
He wasn't. He wasn't involved with Halloween 2.
Suspiria? Have you seen the original Suspiria?
It might be. I haven't seen Suspiria.
Oh, you should change that.
Sorry, if you're an Argento fan, that is embarrassing for me to admit. I've missed it. So Demon and Demons 2. I actually left parties saying to people, I'm sorry, I've got to go home because Demons is on at 9 and I've left. Fulci, the zombie. I just remember that was a mind blowing film for me. I think Richard Johnson was in that, correct? And that was superb. But I think what really caught me was just that. I mean, I was sort of like, after that sequence, I was thinking, how the hell did he do that? He
Real
got
shark.
this guy to walk underwater as a zombie with a shark swimming around him.
Real shark. They drugged the shark.
How did they do it? Do you know the backstory of that? Because I've got to know how the hell he did it.
That sequence was in a tank with a real shark. It's not a great white shark. It's being shot very subjectively. They had tranquilized the shark, but it was still swimming and still breathing fine. And the zombie was actually just a professional diver who could hold his breath for 3 minutes. So there's not a single shot that lasts longer than 3 minutes, but they did slow up the frame rate to get everything they could out of it. But I mean, you're just talking excellent filmmaking. That film also has the splinter in the eye sequence, which is an unbelievably effective, like squeamish sequence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I'd say about Demons is I remember sort of like seeing, and I mean, obviously my Argento and Fulci, probably the problem with me is you probably start naming films and saying that was Fulci, and I've probably seen them because I rarely pay attention to names. That's my problem. But with Demons, it was the same. Demons I watched. I couldn't stop watching it. I watched it over and over and over again because, again, it was. Then I saw Demons 2. I think out of the 2 is still Demons for me because I just find it intensively exciting because what I found Argento did in that film was he just cut straight to the chase. There was not a long exposition. There was a tiny bit, but then he built it up beautifully, but then we were straight into it. And it was this idea of the location of where they were, that they were trapped in a cinema, the way the demons were actually the makeup artists, that he used to like do the demon were absolutely phenomenal, and that was exciting in itself. There's another, I did a poll on, and I think Argento was mentioned. There's another Argento film that a lot. It's not just Suspiria. There's another one that they talk about.
Tenebrae, Bird with the Crystal Plumage.
On Arrow or Shudder, so I have to see that, the Tenebrae one. And I think he was hugely influential in producing as well, wasn't he? He became quite a big.
Well, yeah. I mean, his father, Claudio Argento, was a producer going back well into Italian cinema, but he produced both the Demons films, which were directed by Lamberto Bava, who of course was the son of Mario Bava, who directed Black Sunday. Right. So it all comes together. Yeah. I guess Deep Red, The Hatchet Murders would be probably one that a lot of people would say is the best Argento. I would agree with that.
I'm going to have to start watching more Argento because I'm quite limited on him. I think if you just choose between Demons and Zombie Flesh Eater, I mean, that would be a dreadful choice, really. I think Demons is very close to my heart, though. That's one of my favorite horror films. Loved it.
Well, that's very cool. Now, Jess Grant. Oh no, sorry, that's not going to make any sense to you. Let's go to the comment I meant to hit. Again from our friend Charlie Zombie 7979. Entity with Barbara Hershey.
Is that the one that keeps trying to, get a bit saucy with the
She does. He does a little bit better than try.
Look, that's way back, isn't it? They're talking
81.
Yeah. 80. Yes, I saw Entity for many moons ago. So, and I'm not sure if I read the book, because the problem is I've read so much stuff I can't remember how. But it's Entity, as far as I'm aware, is a woman is being haunted by a spirit that keeps trying to have sex with her. Is that correct?
Correct.
I can't remember the end. I don't remember if it succeeds. Or,
it pretty much succeeds all through the film, depending.
It's like it's repeated
in a Clintonian sense, certainly. So I mean, but there again, there is a case where you have a horror film that's taking a real social subject that's really uncomfortable, which is sexual assault.
Yeah, abuse.
Placing it in a fantasy environment where it's a kind of safe, but you can say things now about that subject that you couldn't say if you were making a film that was literally just about rape. And that's, I think, very powerful. And that's one of the gifts the horror genre gives us, is that all this popcorn entertainment, which is what the mainstream critics always just thrust upon horror, kind of ignore the point, which is that we need safe environments to explore social issues where there aren't a lot of good answers yet. If there were good answers, we wouldn't need horror films to be made of.
Looking at films like I Spit on Your Grave and stuff like that, you know, which of course is the modern remake. It's like people, I totally agree, people make this assumption, they look at the cover and they think it's going to be an exploitation film. And actually that's all about revenge. That's all about kind of like, it's difficult, isn't it? Because like with films like it's that fine line between what you think is exploitative now, what, you know, kind of like in the age of being hyper vigilant about that kind of thing, what is exploitative and what has actually got a meaningful message behind it. It's that kind of, and I suppose in the 80s, yeah, there were situations where you kind of think, well, is that, you know, really necessary? I mean, how much is that? Is that just exploitative? How much is that because you want people to watch your films? So you're just bunging in a few really shocking things. The Entity, though, of course, centers around, I think that's the main,
it is
sustained plot. So it's kind of like, so that doesn't really fit into that kind of sort of more exploitative cinema. I think at the time, I was quite young at the time when Entity came out, and of course, because my father was a lapsed Catholic, you know, any dodgy, saucy scenes, you know, I was sent out of the room. We'd have to go around and watch it on the Betamax, you know, sort of right around my mate's house. But I think it had quite, yeah, I'd have to watch it again. I did watch it, but it had quite an impact on me. And the idea is terrifying, actually. The idea that you are consistently being attacked by an unknown source.
Right, which I mean, on one level, any attractive woman walking down the street experiences that on a minor level. Like the idea that you can't be safe anywhere from at least the more base impulses. Again, what other genre could even present this in any meaningful way? I would argue that exploitation is exactly the right place to explore this.
Yeah.
Because who needs that message the most? The guy who wants to leer, right? He needs that message. So he's not going to watch a Hallmark film about it. He's not.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And that I think what is really exciting is the reclamation of you know, getting more women directors to the forefront. I mean, I watched this, was it Quadruple X, I think was the one I watched about 5 years ago, with 4 or 5 female directors that had done shorts of horror films. And of course, you've got American Psycho as well, which you think is like going to be a highly exploitative, you know, Bret Easton Ellis. And that's a female director at the helm there, of course. That's Mary Lambert actually directed that. But that's the question, is kind of like, you know, I mean, if you look at Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I think that was the longest screaming I've ever known in history. I mean, that went on for 20 minutes. I don't know what her throat was like at the end, but when she gets into the fountain, of course, 20 minutes of screaming. The thing is like, exploitation is a very difficult word, because I don't think horror does exploit. I think horror shines torches in dark areas which people don't necessarily want to look at, which actually needs to be looked at, because it sparks very debates need to be brought into the open at all times. And I think what impresses me about horror is it's always done that. I mean, I've been teaching the Gothic genre to A level. And what is really interesting is, of course, the feminist critics that come out that study this Gothic genre are enormous, the horror genre, you know. And of course, you've got all the makings of the, you know, the foundation of horror is that the female is kind of imprisoned by an evil tyrant with staring eyes. And there's always an impetuous hero involved. Now, what's interesting is the impetuous hero, you know, the guy faints and gets hysterical as well as the female, and that's the essence of horror. That goes way back. And of course, the kind of films I find interesting, not necessarily exploitation, realistic reactions to how you would be in that situation. That's what I kind of look for, amongst the men and the women. And, you know, what horror puts you in extraordinary situations. And that's what I enjoy about it. What I also like about horror is I'm allowed to be removed from my very normal, nice, suburban, quiet, you know, town, and taken somewhere which I've never been before, and allowed to experience secondhand what a character is going through in that situation. But in my head, I'm placed there as well. So exploitation, yeah, I think exploitation, not so much in horror, no. And if it is, I think horror fans are normally very intelligent. In my experience, I think they sniff out things that are a bit vacuous or not very good quite quickly anyway, or things that were like, you know, just style over content.
And while we're mentioning the great female horror directors, I want to point out that my favorite film of this year, of course, was Relic, which was directed by Natalie Erica James.
Yeah, I haven't seen it.
Who just managed to do a generational, a feminine generational horror story about aging and death in a way that, oh my God, is incredibly powerful, and I think it's an instant classic of the genre. So.
I'm going to mention Antonia Bird with Ravenous, because my friend Julia Morgan, my brilliant friend Julia online, has also mentioned Antonia Bird, because I remember that I recently did a poll of female directors, of course the Babadook. And what's interesting is you know, in horror, of course, it's the person with the film with the most money is sometimes going to go, because that's the most populous one. That's the one that most people kind of know about. But Relic was mentioned. Someone did actually say in that poll, why wasn't Relic in there? And I was like, I do apologize, because we're only allowed 4. I couldn't get another one in.
That might have been me being an asshole, by the way. I'm just
no, actually, I love that. I do like it when people come forward on the polls and say, what about, because that opens up me thinking, I haven't seen that or done that, and I need to put that on the list.
Yeah, definitely do. I think it's the most powerful film of the year, in a year that had a lot of great films, but I do think it is, to me, it is a film that I know that I'm going to revisit many, many times, and is still going to affect me, and that's the rarest of horror breeds. So let's talk a little bit about your writing, and where you want to go with that. I mean, what's your current goals as far as what do you hope to add to the genre?
Well, I self-publish. I mean, you know, what I did was I sort of, I kind of, you know, I take a bit of advice, but it's a kind of more of a very serious, enjoyable hobby for me. And so what I did was when I wanted to write, I went online and I went to the LinkedIn community. I also started the Salem's Lot Appreciation Society, which is a fun thing that I stuck on LinkedIn. You know, it's LinkedIn is more for business, you know, and I'm putting on Salem's Lot Appreciation Society because I just want people to talk about Salem's Lot. And they all kind of saying the same thing. I was asking about publishers, you know, and sort of like, and I kind of like, I mean, I was an actress for a while, and I was, the reasons I went into acting was I had no interest in fame. I was more of a rogue and vagabond type. I love the idea of being in a large cart in Elizabethan times with Shakespeare, going around the country and doing a little play and then going to the pub and drinking as many ales as possible, you know. And I was very interested in the group theatre. So like the group theatre was like Stella Adler, you know, I trained under the method of physical action. So I was really, I'd always been interested in communities, in like people all living in the same house, all doing plays or art, and being a community in themselves. And that was kind of, and when I got into the acting profession, that wasn't necessarily the case. That was a very much an old idea, and they've moved on, and people have become much more like packages now in their own right, you know, and sort of like business savvy. And that's not me as a person. And the same kind of applies to writing, in that I was not particularly interested in, you know, writers had warned me, the slog, you know, the huge slog it takes to get a publisher. It's just like, and I think if you're committed and you have the time, which I don't, you know, and you are driven which I'm not, then you would be seeking a publisher. But my cousin put me onto self-publishing, and it was a much simpler route. It was like KDP, it was Kindle Publishing. I went on there, and I could just create my own book, and I was like, that's fantastic. So I don't have deadlines, I don't have people taking a huge cut of my money, and I don't know what they've done. I don't have kind of like the whole circus jamboree of it. I can just kind of like, I'm just me, myself, and I with my laptop, and I can create my own book cover, and I can stick my own, and I loved it. So what I did was I started to write, and I loved the self-publishing. I'm a big fan of self-publishing. So I self-published my degree papers online to help other students, and I self-published them into a book, and it was fantastic. Right, I can do this with the Park Gates. So I literally I loved the process of going out, taking a photo of, taking my own picture, went to Park Gates, sort of like with the moon was full, and kind of like took my own picture of it. But I like the experimentation process of writing. So it was like putting it all together myself with no outside interference, with no, I kind of, I take as an example Stephen King and The Shining with Kubrick. What a nightmare. Sort of like Kubrick finishes a masterpiece, King hates it. And then and even to the point that I think I read The Shining the other day, like he did this massive long forward in his book, make sure he gets Kubrick in there, sort of like, that, I just want to bring up the Kubrick situation. And I thought, oh, I don't want that to ever. I mean, like, that's not my purpose for writing, is to just find like-minded people who say, oh, I really like that story. Here's one of mine. And it operating more on a community level, rather than, me wearing a Versace dress, going down the red carpet with lots of friends, that I'm never going to see again. So I got this Park Gates, did the book coming. And if you haven't been on KDP Publishing, you haven't got any money, you haven't got much time, and you want to self-publish, please do it. It's been wonderful. So when I started to create the book and they sent it back to me, and I sort of saw, I was like really excited. I thought, this looks amazing. I then got involved with Hellbound Books contacted me, and they used me as a kind of to read their books and to just give critical reviews. And I really enjoyed doing that. And again, it was a time problem with me. But I started to get sent books which I was reading. And what's great about that as a writer is when you read other people's work, I think it's like an actor. It's really important to see other people's work. It's really important to read other people's work, because that it can give you lots of ideas, and you get a sense of, who you'd like to collaborate with. I mean, one of my dreams would be to write, to collaborate. So, for instance, I know a lot about Dracula, I know a lot about Gothic, but I would love to be a collaborative writer with someone else in writing a horror for screen, or for a film, or for a short film. Because writing books, I take my hat off to people that do it. It is immensely hard work. Life gets in the way, and I mean, I think, again, I keep citing Stephen King. I mean, but he talks about the rigid discipline. He said, like, he gets, I don't know if it's his routine now, is getting up at 9, writing for 3 hours, break. Back at the typewriter, 3 hours, break. And it goes on like that from 9 till 5 o'clock regularly. Admittedly, he's probably got the money and the time to do that. Whereas when someone like me, I have about 10 different things going on at a given time. So I said the only time I would be able to write a full-scale novel is if you locked me in a room for 6 months and isolated me away from all my other responsibilities, and I could just write it. So what I've done is put my toes in the water. And what I did was I rushed it a bit because there was a competition. I rushed the story at the end. The first story, I have a plan of 6 of them, of short stories, and also my cousin was very influential in 3 of them. And the story I only managed to write 1 and get it self-published, but essentially I have a plan for 6, and I took my influences from things like Tales of the Unexpected, this kind of idea that I love the idea of a short, quick fix of a story, and there is a twist at the end, something you're not expecting. So basically what this one is about, because I'm a teacher, I've had a lot of experience at school, I've worked in the schools for a long time. So I took the idea of an English teacher who is, and I'm going to ruin the ending right now, to get the premise of the book. This English teacher, she's having a bad day in her class, and she has a student that she's become quite fascinated by, who's a Romanian student who's about 15, and the teacher's very frustrated with her because this girl never works. She never kind of, the teacher's constantly having a go at her. But on the other hand, then the teacher has a good day and it's fine. And with this particular day, the teacher's tired. She keeps scratching at her neck. There's something hurting her neck. The lights are too bright, and this student, she finds something very freaky about this student. When she goes over to his student keeps falling asleep on the desk, and and the teacher just feels she's emanating something she doesn't like, and so essentially she's become strangely fixated with the student, doesn't know why. Anyway, the student leaves, and what's happened is she sees a photo on the wall, and it's of a friend called Susan who's disappeared, who's another teacher, and this teacher's disappeared for 6 months, just missing. And so this teacher's missing her, whatever. And so what happens is this student comes back into at 4 o'clock and asks her to walk her home, and says she's seen this teacher in the park, and she has to walk past park. And so this teacher's like, "What on earth are you talking about? This woman's missing. She can't be in the park." And anyway, it turns out, I mean, I'm not good at, if you've got me in an office and give me a synopsis, it'd be absolutely diabolical. The premise is the teacher, I'm leading you to believe that the student has turned into is like a familiar, is turning into a vampire, and it's not. It's the wrong person. It's the teacher that is turning into a vampire. So what I'm trying to leave clues in the whole story is about the fact that the lights are too bright, her neck's hurting, she's woken up with the windows constantly open, at night, her friend's missing. So the premise is at the end of the story, the twist is you realise that all those little breadcrumbs I've been leaving throughout the story, the students being the red herring, it's actually the teacher. And so what happens at the end of the story is the student disappears. There's a sort of like, the student's found lying in the park, virtually drained of blood, with second stage hypothermia, and the teacher is missing. So then you realise, and the missing teacher, Susan, is the vampire who's been feeding on her friend for about a few months. So it's like Tales of the Unexpected D type things. That was told really badly, but that is the first story. That's the premise of it. And then the other ones are going to be, the next one I'm working on is one called House, working title, which is based on the Greek myths, which is about the idea of the cursed man. So there's this guy that keeps going to the same museum every day at 7 o'clock in the morning. And this Bill, who's a curator in the museum, becomes quite fascinated with him. This guy turns up 7 o'clock every morning, and he stays there till 6 o'clock on this bench and doesn't move. And the guy is haggard. He's smelling. He hasn't. And one day, Bill becomes interested in him and starts a conversation with him. And this guy called Tony starts to kind of get closer to him, and then decides Bill can come back to his house, and Tony's going to tell him the story of his life. Anyway, this story is awful, all these dreadful things happening to him. And what it turns out, to cut a long story short, is he is a descendant of the House of Atreus. The House of Atreus was essentially, in Greek mythological times, was Tantalus was cursed for killing his children and feeding them to the gods in the pies. And from that day on, the gods cursed his entire generations of families. So it goes down to, they all get cursed in nasty ways. So Agamemnon, dies and gets cut by an axe and all that. So what it is it's basically about the idea of, at the end, the twist is you work out that he's actually a modern descendant of the House of Atreus, which is why all these terrible things happening to him. And that's the second one I was looking at.
And that's what you're working on right now. So I'm going to encourage everyone to just run over to Amazon as soon as we're done, which we'll be wrapping up in just a few minutes.
Which Us at Dusk is on, but that one, the part, and sorry if the ending was rushed. I was trying to enter a competition. So the great thing about KDP is I can start editing them. So I'm going to probably recoup it, edit it, make it a bit better, and send it out again.
Yep. So everyone, head on over there and show your support. I remember very vividly when I just started taking writing seriously, how uphill of a battle it all seemed. And any support you show, you can't imagine what it means.
Yeah.
It's just an uphill battle for a new writer, a new artist of any sort, to get any purchase. And I don't mean that in money. I mean purchase as if you're gripping the ground like you're clawing at a tombstone in a graveyard in the middle of the night. It's very, very tough to feel like you're getting anywhere. So if you can go over and check out the work and maybe leave some feedback, that's an amazing thing, and I really do encourage that.
Yeah, that's the best part, is when you feedback to other people and you give them some ideas. My cousin already has. He looked at me and said, you need to change a couple of things there. So what's great is you edit it, you take it back, edit it, release it, until you're happy.
Awesome. So I want to thank you for coming on today. This was a great conversation. I think everyone... I had
a great time. Thank you so much for asking me.
On this channel, of course, on tomorrow, actually, you can see me in pain over on the S'mores and Doors podcast channel, where I'll be eating a ghost pepper or two or maybe three and probably dying on the air.
Really there, or is it incredibly hot and you're going to die?
It's incredibly hot, and I'm probably going to die.
Good luck, mate, with that.
Yeah, I won't be alone. So, and then on Monday, I have the great indie short horror filmmaker Emma Dark coming on. That is an early show as well. That will be a 4 p.m. show because, again, of a time difference. You may notice that I'm doing a lot of shows featuring folks from overseas. Well, that's because, a lot of our overseas friends are in lockdown like we were back last spring. And they could use our exposure and our love right now a little bit more than we could. Don't worry, we'll have it miserable again in a few months, and they can help us out and repay the favor. But for right now,
coming to the end now, because we've got the third vaccine has just arrived in the UK, and it's just been absolutely insane.
Listen, the Pfizer vaccine was born right here, so in Jersey.
Thank you.
That's where the heat is right now. And then on Wednesday, guys, of the new week, the 13th, is the return of Critical Pursuit, the most dangerous game show, where we'll have 6 contestants take on a litany of questions from me and see who comes out on top with their genre knowledge. Rachel, thank you so much for coming on, and good luck with all things. Stay in the community, stay in touch, and definitely when you're ready to drop something else, let us know so we can all help guide the path forward for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone out in the chat who endured me for this hour and a half. Have a great one. Stay safe, people.
Stay safe, everybody. God bless. Thank you. Bye.
Exposes herself to an assortment of radiation. Some, such as the solar rays, are heaven sent.